Thank you very much, Brian. And I feel we're absolutely privileged to have this opportunity to have this vision as we're going about our everyday lives and our everyday businesses, just to step back and to think of where the world's going in this industry. And to have heard from PwC and Brian Smith, I think it's a real insight as to where to plan for the future. And now we've got, over the next nearly half an hour till 2:45, we've got your opportunity to take advantage of the panel that we've got here today. And we're going to have a bit of a furniture shift. We're just going to bring some chairs up. Can this can come off as well? Yeah, we've got a mic. And while we're doing that, have a think about what sort of questions you would like to ask from the expert panel.
Okay, ready to go, I think. Okay, Ian Welland, I'm the Chief Executive of Watford and West Herts Chamber of Commerce. The first comment I wanted to make, though, Paul, is it's an absolute honour to hear this information, and particularly from somebody who's not a farmer person per se, but I'm finding this absolutely enthralling, I have to say. But I'm going to ask the panel a business question, if I may, because I think, Joe, you mentioned about competitive development consortium. I understand that purely and simply of working together and getting important businesses, important companies working together for mutual outcomes. But how does the panel feel that IP will be protected? And I don't want the lawyers to answer this, I would like you to answer it. Because IP is so important these days, and we read about it in the Sunday press and etc. about IP not being protected enough. And I think David Cameron also made a comment about IP about 2 weeks ago. So I'd like to hear the panel's views on how IP will be protected.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. Maybe I'll kick off first. And you're absolutely right. I suppose IP protection has been the key element of this sort of industry. But then again, people do challenge the point about a 20-year patent life that people need to take on when the product's still in R&D, which means by the time you come to market, at best you've got 10 years, maybe you've got 7 years worth of commercial life behind it. Is that really the right sort of system to encourage innovation the way that we want it today? And Paul, you alluded it to with AMR, came up with the Alzheimer's one as well, that maybe you look at market exclusivity 20 years from getting drug approval, so at least you've got a decent runway behind that. In terms of how to protect IP, though, formally, I think in this new world, particularly when it's related to outcomes, there's a lot of know-how that then protects it. Even when the drug comes off patent, if you can demonstrate, well, through our data sets, we know who best responds to this. We know from a behavioural perspective how to get people to adhere to the medicine, how to take the drugs as instructed. There's a lot of IP that people can then use post-patent to actually secure some market exclusivity as well. And we've seen companies with really good differentiated devices with a generic product in it, they've been able to sustain a price increase because they say, listen, we know how to get people to auto-inject themselves with this product, etc. In terms of IP, when it comes to strategic alliances, that's probably the biggest hurdle that we see when it comes to this. And that pre-competitive discovery federation I described is all pre-patent. So it really is around generation of the best ideas. And then you're looking much more in terms of a collaborative approach across it. So you're seeing, at the moment, a lot of it driven from philanthropy. And most great examples of Medicines for Malaria Venture, for instance, that operates on those. I think the push will come from the regulator. They'll say, listen, well, how come we can do this in malaria? We can't do it for commercial applications. You need to change and do things differently, which might be about pre-commitments in terms of pricing, access, etc., in order to incentivize the industry, so to move away from the classic patent protection. Does anyone else like it?
I'll stick to that if I can. Yeah. The other thing the thought that crossed my mind there is that, of course, what that is, that intellectual property protection problem, and I fully endorse Joe's comments about, in some ways, know-how will obviate some IPR protection, is that problem is a co-evolutionary problem, in that we've got a legal environment that has evolved for an R&D environment of 100 years ago. So we might fully expect, especially the pressures from areas like orphan diseases and stuff, to see changes in the legal environment. And in other words, it will co-evolve with the technological environment. So it will be a problem, and it'll just like any evolution, it will be demonstrated by lots of people getting killed and dying and stuff. But you will see an evolution of the legal environment as at the same, grudgingly and haltingly around the evolution of the technological environment. That's just the way that complex adaptive systems work.
I was just going to say one thing. A lot of the consortia are there to try and drive value that wouldn't otherwise necessarily be realised. So by combining the IP, the consortia can really drive the value. And there are examples where companies are contracting together to understand how they share in the value. In a lot of those consortia, particularly in a lot of the joint ventures, there's contracts around how the value is actually shared. But the purpose and objective of those consortia is really to drive and realise value that otherwise wouldn't be realised by not collaborating.
Thank you. I think some excellent points there, particularly Joe. I think the protection of IP for patents is actually still there, and I don't see massive change actually, Brian. But what I do see is that I see the opportunities to obtain patent protection and other forms of registered IP to get easier in the sense that you get patent thickets. You need to be able to see what IP there is already out there to be able to see what you're doing and what you can do in the future. The other aspect is that I think IP protection is generally working well, but the issue is more about market access. You can get the patent protection, you spend all the money on development, and then not have a drug that anyone wants to buy at the end of it. So it's more of a commercial problem than I think of an intellectual property problem. Anyone else like to ask a question?
Darren Spavik from Event & Partners. In other industries where there's been a big change that's happened, it's normally been led by a visionary leader that's been brave enough to take risks and to push their companies. Has the pharma industry got those visionary leaders who can take that risk, who are going to push boundaries and stand up to shareholders to see them through?
Can I add to that question, actually, which other than the leadership, at the big companies, for example, is there enough in mid-management that are going to back any change in strategy?
I suppose I'd start by challenging the premise of your question that although there's lots of crap written about the Steve Jobs of the world, actually most industry change is not driven by mavericks, great leaders. It's in the management literature they call it the myth of the great leader. It's mostly driven by lots and lots and lots of very, very small incremental changes. But it just take us on to an interesting area of, are the industry's current leading companies likely to be to help or hinder the change process? Okay. And it's an interesting question because, let's imagine I took you back in my time machine to 1870, okay, and we went to some intelligent people and said, take me to your pharmaceutical industry, and they said, okay, there's the apothecary over there. No. The pharmaceutical. Well, that's our pharmaceutical industry. So, well, the pharmaceutical industry is going to get huge. So invest some money in it, but don't invest money in apothecaries. Invest money in those guys on the Rhine playing with coal tar. They would have laughed you out of the room. Okay? And there is an issue in organisational economics. They call it, forgive the jargon, they call it institutional isomorphism. Okay, the big companies are, for various reasons, and a whole set of reasons, are pretty useless at changing. And it's that gives the incumbents advantages. Okay? Now, it may or may not happen like that in the pharmaceutical industry, but I think anybody who bet on the future of the pharmaceutical industry being the future of its current leaders would be naive. Does that make sense? Okay.
Would you like to follow up?
I was just going to say, I think if you look over the last 10 years, and you look at PE and how the industry's been doing in the eyes of the investor, there was a bit of a slump. But now if you look at pharmaceutical, there's a really wide spread of PE and price earnings ratio across the pharmaceutical industry. So there are some real stars and there are some that are languishing a bit. And I think for some years, there was a question as to how much money is being invested in real, true innovation, where lots of drugs coming through were Me Too products or second or third or fourth to market of a similar type of class. But I think over time, there's been a real drive for innovation. And you see some companies are starting to focus more, and those that are doing very well have the very high PEs, and investors are seeing it because that innovation is starting to come through. So the likes of BMS with its string of pearls, Gilead with its Solvardi product and their HIV franchise. There are lots of companies that are driving the market.
Yeah, I've just got a thought there about leadership, actually, because if you think 20 years ago, the classic head of a CEO of a pharma company would be someone who came through R&D. And then we went through a slew of commercial-led leaders, and they're probably the majority of people who are here. So Andrew Whitty at GSK, Joe Jimenez at Novartis, Chris Vivac at Sanofi. I'd class them as being commercial guy. There's even a lawyer in there, which is Ian Reid, of course, from Pfizer. So I think you're seeing much more sort of diversity in terms of the skills that's needed. But I guess I'm sort of following what Steve says. I think in order to have visionary leadership, you need to free yourself from short-term requirements to meet shareholder expectations. And it's some of the companies which got the luxury of looking into the longer term that I think are the most inspiring. I mean, Roche, because of its ownership structure, can look ahead. And therefore, maybe is that the reason why Severin Schwan is, particularly visionary in terms of his outlook. Similarly, Novo Nordisk, I think, again, because of its foundation status, can be very visionary in terms of what it's doing. So I wonder if it's more around sort of ownership and structure rather than specifically leadership there.
And I don't know if this is a question you feel able to answer, but to what extent can visionary leaders actually drive change in big organisations? Do you have any thoughts on that, or should we, Brian, from what you've seen?
Again, they can, but all the evidence seems to suggest that when they do, they haven't. It's been their leadership team. If you think about what we ask of a great leader in a company the size of Sanofi or somewhere, it's ridiculous. We expect Superman. Huge breadth of technical knowledge, a huge breadth of personal and leadership knowledge, attention to think big and to pay attention to details, and to be a PR person, all of those things. And in fact, when you look at what happens in leadership models of great companies, not just in pharma, but in big corporates generally, it's to do with this diverse and well-functioning leadership team, top leadership team, and that's what makes it really, really, really difficult. And that's what seems to differentiate the wheat from the chaff, as it were.
Thank you. Question over there.
Mira Wyman, Romney Consultants. Joe seemed to allude to a structure that we're at the crossroads of philanthropy, R&D, and social enterprise. And with focusing on think big strategy, think strategic. Do you have an idea, Joe, what that structure would look like?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. Again, I think a lot of the key to it is getting scientists to collaborate and federate in the right sort of way. So I think that kind of structure is with a federation type model, where you've got a collection of players which all have got a key part to play in terms of patient-centered outcomes. And that federation gets rewarded in terms of budget per patient. So you're beginning to see some semblance of it happening, but if, for an example, with cardiovascular, if it was a budget of £1,000 per cardiovascular patient that was allocated to a consortia, and that consortia had some pharma companies in there providing statins, clinical intervention, you also had rehab services, but you also have preventative measures in terms of nutritional advice and stress management. And that consortia gets rewarded a fixed budget per patient, and it's up to that federation to work out best how to ascribe the value. And in fact, it could get into a situation where a pharma company gets as much value by not pushing its products, but instead pushing to more of a preventative thing than not. So it's that kind of model that we think will pervade in terms of pulling all of those elements together, philanthropy, the industry, academia, etc. In terms of examples where it's happening, we're beginning to see some, particularly in around the Leeds cluster. They're talking about doing something similar in diabetes and just recognising they've got the constituent parts around that to be able to do it. You see it happen on a local level in the States, and I think you're just going to see more and more happen because you've got the predictability of a fixed budget, you've de-risked payers and providers from having to do that, and you're getting the best out of that consortium of players.
Claire Ward, Independent Pharmacy Federation, and I'm just picking up on that last point. From the perspective of community pharmacists, they are now being expected to change quite a lot of their business model so that it isn't simply about the delivery of medicines, but about delivery of services, because it's a recognition that services, particularly in changing behaviour and coping with the comorbidities that you talked about earlier and the huge impact that's having on health services, is actually part of the way in which we need to change some of the impact on health. So whilst not immediately good for the pharma industry, if it's simply about drugs, what do you think from the public policy side? Can we change behaviour in this country? But particularly, what are we going to do about impact around faster growing countries? Because are they going to follow the same route as us in terms of diabetes healthcare conditions?
Sorry, just before you answer, Graham, you next, or is it a different point? Or is it?
Graham Phillips, I'm a community pharmacist. A lot's been talked about innovation. I'm wondering, do we need innovation or do we need implementation? The UK drugs bill is around £10 billion. 50% of the medicine's never taken. 15% of hospital admissions are in some way drug-related, half of which is drug interactions or drug-patient interactions, and the other half broadly is poor compliance, which has led to the medicines optimisation agenda, which is about the way individuals relate to their medicines. It's still the case that broadly the industry ignores the community branch of the pharmacy profession, to my frustration. Just to give you one example, we did a project around type 2 diabetes, but we looked at the entire metabolic syndrome, and we demonstrated by working better with patients and spending time with them, we could improve concordance and compliance using medicines optimization, medicines use reviews, with huge benefits to all the parameters of the metabolic syndrome. So I guess my message is, yes, by all means, let's have some innovation. But if we're going to have expensive biologics and all of this, but the patients are going to continue not to take the medicines and the pharmacy profession who handles them all is going to continue to be ignored, why will the governments continue to invest at that level?
Yeah, I do believe community pharmacy is a key lever in terms of this, for the very points that you make out there, Graham, in terms of the frontline approach with the patient, really understanding them in terms of adherence and compliance, and then what advanced and enhanced services can do in terms of community pharmacy. Now, it's in the public domain, but I led the cost of service inquiry for community pharmacy in 2011, which is the framework under which we currently operate. And I suppose the negotiations as we perceive at the moment is still an ongoing negotiation or haggle within that framework. I think, I would like to see with the next cost of service inquiry, whenever that comes in, probably post-election, that all of those facets are brought into the fore, because you're right, there's an economic benefit in terms of doing that. I suppose in the role of community pharmacy, though, there are a number of new pharmacies who opened up. Again, the 100-hour rule enabled that. So it's a question of, is there overcapacity in the UK from a community pharmacy perspective? So I think that'll be probably taken into the mix, and really going into those enhanced advanced services will be the key to success there. And in terms of exporting our models then to emerging markets and other areas with that, I think we often see the UK in terms of leading the way there, because we know how to get very efficient healthcare to our populations. So again, we often get called to, compare and contrast the UK system, including community pharmacy, to other countries. And the other thing that we're seeing, particularly in the UK, is the pharma industry getting much more involved in understanding, is there more that they can do with community pharmacy as well? So I think rather than trying to bypass it with home care or something like that, how can we work with the pharmacists together to do that? And I do wonder if you might then see local implementation through the CCGs, Because again, innovation tends to happen, I believe, on a smaller scale through piloting, etc., with particular disease areas of a focus to CCGs. So it could be what HIV in Lambeth or cardiovascular in Hackney, for instance, could be the driving force between trying to pull that all together.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because to some extent you're sort of, with respect, you're confusing the terms, implementation and innovation. And innovation includes implementation. Okay, it's academics get very fussy about what words mean. There is no question that the emerging markets have already followed us in terms of this epidemiological shift towards diabetes and all of the related comorbidities. And I don't think there's also any question that some business model is going to emerge at a primary care type level to manage all of that. Because even if we can change our behaviour, some of us are going to change our behaviour somewhat, but not everybody is going to change their behaviour to become fit and lean and healthy eating. So for decades we're going to have this huge population that's going to need to be managed. At the moment, we all look at community pharmacists and see them playing a role in that. And if you look at what's happening in the States with Walgreens and stuff, you'd expect that to be a part. But I also wonder too whether some of that will be there'll be an alternative model or a complementary model that's heavily technology oriented. When I have an implant that does all the monitoring and it speaks to my phone, which then speaks to a server somewhere with an intelligent system that keeps me well. So it comes back to this point I made about fragmentation of business models. It may be that community pharmacists have this huge role to play in the managing of this, the Honda group that Peter Street talked about. But of course, there'll be an even larger group of us, hopefully most of the people in this room, who are fairly well at the moment, or just trying to stay that way. Not trying to avoid being one of these 700 a day who are newly registered with type 2. I'm sitting here wearing my activity tracker as I do so, and it'll be really interesting to see whether community pharmacists take part in that business model, because culturally and psychologically, they're almost as embedded in managing the ill as the pharmaceutical industry is, and relatively few, my perception is that relatively few thought leaders in that area are focused on keeping people well in the first place.
I think there will become, in the new world, there will become pressure coming from the pharmaceutical industry to actually collaborate with the community pharmacies. So where they're providing the service, where they can help deliver patient outcomes and improve compliance, I think the pharmaceutical industry will collaborate more. It's a new model in delivering patient outcomes, because they'll have to ensure patient outcomes in order to get the premium pricing, in order to get the reimbursement. So I think there'll be a lot more collaboration in the future.
Thank you. For my part, I would say that it's easy to look at this the wrong way. If you look at how many community pharmacies are there at the moment, and the question is whether there are 2,000 too many, and should 2,000 in this country close? That's the sort of question you hear asked, and I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's not what are pharmacists doing today and a lot of dispensing of medicines, but it's the servicing in the future, the opportunities, and to provide outcomes, health outcomes, in a way that, pharmacy it's so well documented that pharmacy is so accessible to the public. People can just walk in, they don't need to make an appointment. Community pharmacists are very much trusted. So there's a huge opportunity for community pharmacy to provide new services, and they should be properly funded for those new services in a way which then reflects the benefits that the community pharmacists are providing to society and to saving money across other healthcare. I see other opportunities for pharmacy other than what we've just been talking about. We've mentioned healthcare apps and wearables. Where are patients going to go for that sort of advice? Doctors are too busy, they don't have time, and you have to queue up and you have to wait. People can drop into a community pharmacy and there's going to be a growing role for community pharmacy to help people with things like to help patients with adherence, by helping them with how to respond to an app. If your blood pressure is of a certain level, is that anything to worry about? What should you do? Come back and do such and such. Community pharmacy has a huge role in the Hondas, for sure. I think we've got time for one more question. Sandy.
I'm Sandy
Hold
Eisen.
on a second.
I'm Sandy Eisen. I'm from London.
Thank you.
I'm independent pharmaceutical physician with many years in the industry and as a regulator. Over the last decade or so, I've done quite a bit of work on what are called biosimilars, which are really biogenerics. And I'm surprised that we're coming to the end of a meeting that hasn't even mentioned these even once. And I think it's a marvelous example of the impact of politics, often hidden politics, on healthcare, because we have laws that allow biosimilars in both Europe and the US. The European law was formulated by the Commission and has been implemented by the European Medicines Agency in a manner to be generally favourable to allow the introduction of biosimilars. And we've had biosimilars approved since 2006, and for some products now they're getting to 50% market share. In the United States, the biosimilar law was introduced as part of the BIPAC Obama healthcare law, a small part of it, but it was introduced in such a strange and distorted form due to the lobbying of the mainstream biotech industries that the law is fundamentally anti-biosimilar companies, so that even now, more than 4 years after the law has come into force, not a single company has made an application because the law is set up to make them fail. So therefore, Europe remains at least 5 years ahead of the US on biosimilars. We're all familiar with generic medicines and prescribing now. Biosimilar, and we take it for granted. Biosimilars are trying to introduce the same paradigm to the very expensive, very important high-tech medicines that were mentioned on the lists shown, all the monoclonal antibodies, but they haven't got anywhere in the States because of politics, basically. It's an interesting observation I've made that nobody's mentioned them yet.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sandy. I write a lot on biosimilars as well, actually, which is another section. And it's interesting, I met with Waxman about 10 years ago, and as you know, Waxman really pioneered the generic bill coming to the market, and he said to me, look, Joe, listen, all of this fuss about biosimilars is exactly what we had with chemical-based generics when those came through, and people were just, you know, obviously the scare stories about these aren't safe, etc., and these aren't comparable. There's no question, I think, you know, biosimilars and pricing for that can really impact healthcare economies, to your point. You know, particularly categories like EPO, where price has gone through the floor. So a lot of pricings, biosimilar EPO is 10% of the originator from Amgen, etc. So it can improve healthcare economies. However, I guess people are grappling with the different risks around biosimilars coming to market. You can't rely on an international non-proprietary name, so you can't have a sort of generic molecule prescribing as you would with a regular pharmaceutical product. So, you know, you couldn't write a script for paroxetine and get Seroxat, because people are saying these aren't directly substitutable unless you can do that. So if you can't rely on that molecule name for your e-prescribing system to pop it up, you need to have some sort of sales force that makes people aware of it. Risk reward is slightly different, because to bring a biosimilar to market in Europe, we estimate it's between $50 million and $80 million to prove some sort of bioequivalence through a clinical trials process. And also what you might have then is defensive actions by the originator companies. You know, they can drop their price, or their second generation products they can offer at the same price as the expiring biotech product. So I think nonetheless it's you know, got a lot of challenge for biosimilar products coming to market, let alone uncertainty over price. And again, we've done analysis that if you're one of 3, people play relatively nicely about price. One of 6, it begins to erode. Any more than 6, then you see that race to the bottom in terms of pricing. But nonetheless, I agree with you, Sandy, we're reaching this new era, and I think particularly with Remsina being approved last year, which was the first monoclonal antibody biosimilar approved in Europe, and so that in itself was a big milestone. So this is biosimilar Remicade. The second thing about that is that it got indication extrapolation. So although they had their evidence in one of the autoimmune conditions, I can't remember whether it was psoriasis or something, They got all of the indications. And in fact, that prompt to get all of the indications came from the EMA, where they said, listen, we think we've got some questions about your mechanism of action here, but looking at it, actually this could be comparable across this. Now that took the industry by a lot of surprise. I was in Dubai at presenting at the Global Biosimilars Conference there, and none of the big players really expected that. That was quite a surprise from that. And I think something like indication extrapolation could then really de-risk that process that I spoke about there. So I think, yes, biosimilars is a key element to this. I agree with you absolutely, Sandy, that the political situation in the US is very different to the one that we have in Europe. And indeed different to the approach in the emerging markets. If you look at Korea, etc., a lot of biosimilar monoclonal antibodies are out there at the moment. Monoclonal antibodies are out there just now. So those are being used in real patients with real physicians. So although we might not touch at the moment biosimilar Herceptin coming out of China, for instance, as soon as they have X thousand patients on it, maybe we will. And if we continue in the UK to ration some of these products, I think patients will be saying, how come it's available in China? So I think we're reaching this change. I think it'll happen longer in the US, but nonetheless, as presented from my graphs, the pressing needs are here in Europe in terms of finding cost-effective medicine. So I agree absolutely with you with that one, Sandy. Anyone else?
And we shouldn't get our heads stuck too far up our own behinds about labels and stuff. You know, a lot of time when I talk about generics, I mean, not minimising the obvious technological and legal and manufacturing and IPR differences between biosimilars and generics. But when I talk about generics quite often, I am essentially talking about biosimilars too. It's just a product category life cycle thing. We're going to see exactly the same thing happening through some of the mechanisms like Joe was just describing there. And, you know, we will in future see the same sort of conditions that we have in the generic small molecule market as we have in the generic big molecule. It'll be minor difference, but effectively, you know, and the point you made about consumers was very interesting. You know, in an age where you have educated people with access to the internet and their government saying to them, I'm sorry, but you can't have, we're rationing that treatment from you, the consumers are going to put up with that crap. They're going to, you know, they're going to phone up their mate in China and get some sent across to them. That's just the way it's going to happen.
I think if you look at the top 10 pharmaceutical products, certainly the top 5, I think 4 out of 5 are biologics now. And the burden of healthcare in the US is going to be immense. And a lot of that cost from pharmaceuticals is going to come from biologics. And at some point, that's going to exert so much pressure that they just won't be able to afford not to adopt biosimilars.
Thank you very much. And I think all that is left is to show our appreciation, please, for our speakers. Okay. To Joe, to Stephen, and to Brian, of course. And I hope you enjoyed the session. Now, I know there was a reference to the slides. They will be available as a PDF afterwards. Thank you also to my colleagues in the Matthew Arnold Board and Life Sciences and Healthcare Sector Group, particularly to Freddie and to Vicky, wherever Vicky is. If anyone came by train and you don't fancy a walk in this beautiful sunshine, back to Watford Junction, if you want to get a cab, we've got some details so to ask Freddie or Vicky on your way out. Thank you also to the other people who have helped with Ping financially and through other support. So that's Watford Chamber of Commerce, Watford Council, and the Hertfordshire LEP. And again, fantastic news we heard again that is affecting Watford and Hertfordshire today. In your packs, please take away your packs with you, but please can you fill in your feedback forms? What did you enjoy? Why did you come? What sort of events would you like in the future? What sort of topics? And we're going to finish now the formal part of the session. We're serving tea and coffee at the back, and there's some soft drinks at the side. I think the panel is staying around for a little bit of time, so if you wanted to pick their brains, they'll be very happy to speak with you. I hope to see you on the way out, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks very much for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed today's event.